Welcome to the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs events, an assessment of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, 1 year on. My name is Michael Miner of the Intelligence Project, and we are delighted to have many hundreds of you with us today. Thank you for joining. A few administrative notes. This virtual event is open to the public. Recording of this session is prohibited without permission. But if you would like to quote something that you hear today, our Belfer Center communications team is standing by and available to support you and help answer any questions. All attendees' cameras and microphones have been muted for this session. Please use the Q&A box once we turn to Q&A for each panel. We will hear from each of our speakers, their discussion as a group, and then we'll move on to Q&A as time allows. Today, we are excited to bring together diverse voices and experience. As we have witnessed over the past year, the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia has dramatically shaped geopolitics in consequential ways. Today, we will unpack drivers, trend lines, and how events have unfolded with an eye to the future. Dr. Fiona Hill of Brookings and former Senior Director on the National Security Council will help frame today with keynote remarks. Our first panel will be chaired by Intelligence Project Senior Fellow Kevin Ryan to discuss the military situation and prospects. We would have a brief interlude around 2 p.m. before we turn to our second panel at 2:15, chaired by Intelligence Project Senior Fellow Paul Colby. They will grapple with the social, economic, and political dynamics. We shall then go into closing comments with Douglas Dillon Professor of Government Graham Allison and Intelligence Project Senior Fellow Rolf Mowat-Larsen. But before we turn to Dr. Hill, I'd like to invite my Intelligence Project colleague, Calder Walton, to say a few words. Calder, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here. And looking at the number of participants we've got, about 300 people already signed up, and we had even more signed up. So this is wonderful to see the impact that our event is having. My name is Calder Walton, and I'm the Director of Research at the Intelligence Project here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to take a moment just to say a big thank you to Michael, to you for putting this event together, and for Elisa, our research assistant. It's always the sign of a good event, a seminar, conference, when things go smoothly, and it will go smoothly. It has gone smoothly, and that's because of all the work that Elisa in particular has put in behind the scenes. As we go through our sessions today, I'd like to think about three issues which stand out for me looking back at the beginning of the war in Ukraine 1 year on. The first one is to do with applied history. That's an effort that we lead here at the Kennedy School, which is the express effort to look to the past in order to inform current policy decision making. What does the past tell us about where we are at the moment and where we might be heading with Putin's war in Ukraine? His threats of nuclear war, which it seems to me have been dialed up and then dialed down. Are we in a situation analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example? We're lucky to have Serhiy Plohy and Michael, as you mentioned, Graham Allison, the doyen of the Cuban Missile Crisis, joining us. How useful is the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy to what is unfolding today? The second thread that I would love our panels to sort of grapple with is what would happen if Putin were to disappear? And to put the issue in a rather pithy format, but I think one that it is important, do we in the West, do we have a Putin problem or a Russia problem? And it seems to me, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, that we actually have more of a Russia problem than a Putin problem. If Putin were to disappear, I do not think that things would suddenly normalize between the West and Russia. Looking at some of the British Foreign Office records that were declassified just last year, and Tony Blair's newly released cabinet papers from the 1990s, it's quite clear that the Russian government has been consistent in what Putin is saying now, but for a long time. They want and demand a redrawing of the European post-war, post-Cold War security arrangement. You look at some of the meetings that Britain's foreign ministers had with Russian ambassadors in the 1990s, and it's the same message that Putin is saying today. There are plenty of people who think like Putin surrounding him, some even more hardline than him. If he was to disappear, it seems to me that unfortunately there's a lot of weight pointing in the direction that things would not normalize. And then thirdly, it's the nature of US intelligence and its allies. A year ago, we witnessed one of the few occasions of an intelligence success. 2 words that we don't normally hear, Michael, but I think it is correct to say that it was a staggering US and, it seems, British intelligence success of unlocking the secrets of Putin's intentions and capabilities when it came to Ukraine. Is this a continuing success on the part of the US government? And in particular, what is the role of open source intelligence about exposing, declassifying, and removing Putin's room for maneuver in terms of his intentions going forward? So those are 3 threads that I hope that the different panels will tackle in their different ways. That's it for me for right now, Michael. Really look forward to this. Back to you.
Thank you, Calder. Terrific questions to think about as we unpack the past year with an eye to the future. And I can think of no one better to start our day than inviting Dr. Fiona Hill to join us. We're pleased to welcome our keynote speaker to share her observations and reflections. Dr. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She recently served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She is author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, and co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Dr. Hill, welcome back to the Belfer Center, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm in a rather unusual setting here, a bit cavernous and echoey. I'm actually sitting in one of the rooms in the Senate. Not because I've been elevated, but because I got called in to testify this morning to the Senate Armed Services Committee along with Roger Zackheim and Bonnie Lynn, and we literally just got out. So there's been hours of grueling, testimony that I've already gone through this morning. But they were very kind as to find me a little space here, so I've got rather dramatic. I could turn it around and see the rest of the Senate buildings, but I won't do that. But what I would like to do is pick up on where Calder lay out the tasks for everyone today, because I think that those are 3 very important threads. And I hope that in my relocation out to the Senate, I'll be able to keep on listening, at least on my phone, to what everybody has to say. I think the issue of applied history as a historian is very important, because what we see in this war in Ukraine is very much Putin's application of history. This is a war of historical narratives. And a year on, we in the West and in the United States are still stuck in the narrative frame that Vladimir Putin has created, or at least as he created at the very beginning of the war. And as we know, there is so much debate about the origins of this war. Was this indeed provoked by the expansion of NATO? A debate, of course, going back to the 1990s, when I myself was at the Belfer Centre working with Graham and with many of the other colleagues who were still there. Is it the result of Ukraine failing to live up to the Minsk Accords, which, if had been fully implemented after they were put in place by France and Germany after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and if they'd been, again, fully implemented, this would have led to severe limitations on Ukraine's sovereignty. All of this is basically created by a framing in which, as Calder was basically alluding to, there was this sort of sense that Russia had the right to a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and certainly in the framing of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called near abroad, a term that Russia used and that we started to use in the 1990s to describe all of the other states that had been part originally of the Soviet Union. And one of the points that I made this morning in the opening statement to the Senate Armed Services Committee is that, you know, right from the very beginning, we in fact did set this conflict in motion in the way that we looked at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I want to clarify this. I mean, all of us who were at the Belfer Center back in the 1990s will, of course, remember, you know, the wars in Yugoslavia, the Balkan Wars, everyone remembers that. But there's a key distinction here that needs to be brought out. When Yugoslavia came apart, the United States did not recognize a successor state. Serbia and Montenegro declared themselves, or Serbia declared Serbia and Montenegro as the successor state, but we never recognized that. And indeed, the Serbian-Montenegrin Federation fell apart. Montenegro went on to get its independence. And at no point did we actually entertain Serbia's claims against the territory of all of the other neighbours. In fact, we treated all of the former Yugoslav member states as essentially equals. That did not happen with Russia. Now, we can all go back to the 1990s and remember some of the thinking in recognizing Russia as the successor state to the Soviet Union. But this is, you know, part of our discussion about the use of history or the predominance of history. We recognize Russia because of that long historical thread of thinking of Russia as previously the Russian Empire and then as the Soviet Union. For those of us who were historians, of course, was a lot of discussion about the continuity of the Soviet state from the Russian Empire, notwithstanding, you know, obviously the distinct political differences, but territorially, of course, the Soviet Union did reacquire a lot of the lands of the Russian Empire that had gotten away at the end of the Russian Revolution, including the Baltic states, which were forcibly incorporated in World War II. And of course, we remember very clearly that Stalin, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, made an effort to retake in Finland. There were attacks, you know, obviously on other territory. At the end of the war, Stalin reversed the agreements with Japan that had ceded southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands to Japan after the Russo-Japanese War back in the early 1900s. So the Soviet Union was in the business of reacquiring Russian imperial territory, you know, for a long period, particularly under Stalin. And as a result of World War II, we saw the Soviet Union acquiring even more territory that hadn't previously been part of the Russian Empire, like, for example, Königsberg or Kaliningrad. So when we recognized Russia as the successor state, we were, of course, focused on who was going to take over not just the command and control of the nuclear weapons arsenal, which was a major feature of the Belfer Center. And I know we're going to get into those discussions with the references, as Calder was already talking about, the Cuban Missile Crisis and, you know, the legacies of the Euro Missile Crisis as well of the 1980s. We gave Russia, obviously, the full benefits of the UN Security Council seat. But we were also worried about who was going to pay off the debts. The Soviet Union had a lot of obligations of sovereign debt, as well as some other debts. And we wanted Russia or some country to take on all of those obligations, not just have the privileges of the state. But as a result of that, we put Ukraine and every other former Soviet country in a kind of grey zone. The fact that even I'm still calling them former Soviet countries. I mean, we're still calling, you know, Poland, formerly country of the Russian Empire, or Finland that, or Austria and Hungary, formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We're not. We continue to sort of think about all of the other states as somehow in a fuzzy grey zone where they weren't quite one thing or the other. And that's really the germination of this problem. Because as Calder was talking about, in terms of, you know, the things that we could see looking at the declassification of materials from the Brits, Tony Blair, but we also see there's some declassification recently of documents from the early meetings between George Herbert Walker Bush and Boris Yeltsin, and, you know, the latter parts of discussions with Gorbachev, but also with Bill Clinton and Yeltsin, that these debates, these tensions are already present there right from the early periods of the 1990s. But what we also see is a complete shift in leadership and leadership perspectives. And as Calder was posing, do we have a Putin or a Russian problem? I would say that we actually, in the first instance, have a leadership problem that centers around Putin, because Putin thinks very differently from Gorbachev and all the people around Gorbachev, from Shevardnadze and Yakovlev and you name it, and also from Yeltsin. In some of the declassified documents where there are discussions between Yeltsin and Bush and Clinton, for example, Yeltsin makes it very clear that he is not an imperial thinker, that he actually values his relationships with his counterparts in Belarus and in Ukraine, and he is not thinking of reacquiring territory. And in fact, of course, in the 1990s, Yeltsin even opens up the prospect of more autonomy, devolution, political devolution, out of necessity, of course, for other parts of the Russian Federation. So a very different perspective. There are documents talking, or where Yegor Gaidar, the prime ministers at the time, talking to members of the US official representation in the embassy about we couldn't conceive of any kind of war of Soviet succession like we're seeing in Yugoslavia at that point. Can't see a conflict with Ukraine. But we know behind the scenes, of course, that there were people who were constantly pressing this issue. We have in 1992, I was at the Belfer Center when this happened, we did a whole report about this back in the USSR. So there's a shift from Andrei Kozyrev, who was then foreign minister in that early period, in his own speeches. Kozyrev makes this infamous speech in Stockholm at the meeting of the OSCE in 1992, in which he basically comes out with a hardline speech that touches exactly on the issues that Calder was raising about Russia's determination to lay claim to the Russian speakers in the near abroad, the right to protect Russian speakers, as if they're still sort of citizens of the state in those territories and potentially to claim territory. And Kozyrev admits afterwards that that wasn't his speech. It was a speech prepared by hardliners back in Moscow. And Kozyrev, is ultimately replaced. We have the rise of Yevgeny Primakov as the foreign minister of Russia, and a very different tone about all of these issues. So it's a shift in leadership that becomes important. I'm sure we'll talk about this over the terms of the discussions today. And then there's the larger question of Russia, which I think itself is rooted in that recognition of Russia as the sole successor state to the Soviet Union, in essence, to the Russian Empire, and what that seems to imply. Basically, if we look at history, Russia's the last empire in Europe. I would actually argue that Britain is still an empire, and Irish, Welsh, and Scottish people might, kind of agree with that. People might, Catalans might say that Spain is still an empire. But in terms of the last real empire that has retained most of its territory and is actually laying claim to a dominance over a larger region, that is Russia. The rest of Europe has moved on from spheres of influence, but Russia persists in seeing things in imperial and in Cold War terms. Putin talks about the past continuously. It's all he talks about. And in that kind of frame, Putin still sees Russia as locked into, and this is where there's the broader Russia problem, into a struggle with the United States over dominance of Europe, beginning with the carving up of Europe between the US and allies and Russia at the end of 1945. In fact, February 1945 at Yalta, it still remains a touchstone for Putin. That's what he wants to see again. He wants to see, as Calder was already alluding to, a recognition by the rest of Europe that Russia has its own sphere of influence and actually has a right to claim additional sets of territory. So that's what our Russia problem is, because it's not just Putin who thinks that, but there's a whole cohort of people around him. And one could argue as to whether that has shifted, those views have shifted over the generations. I think a lot of younger Russians don't remember that, but they've been taught that kind of views of Russian history more recently in school. And Putin has definitely tried to, over the last year of this war, mobilize the Russian population against this kind of view of history. He's now calling the war in Ukraine the third great patriotic war, referencing Napoleonic invasions of Russia back in the 1800s, as well as the Nazi German invasions in the 1940s. And he's saying that this is, again, an existential threat. I think the question that we will be asking ourselves is, does everybody believe this? And I'm sure with some of the colleagues who are on these discussions, you're going to have a serious debate about this today. The final issue that Calder raised about the role of US intelligence, I think, is a pretty critical one. I mean, obviously, the United States' decision to release a lot of the intelligence, to declassify information, has proven consequential in pulling together allies and other partners in defense of Ukraine. It facilitated that, even if, we might have at other points got things wrong and perhaps we're not as prepared as we should have been. I think that intelligence decision was pretty critical. But I think related to this larger discussion of history, the role of history is critical as well. We need to message, very seriously and very clearly what this war is all about, what it is and what it isn't. And the more that we keep debating, whether we provoked it, rather than, pushing back against these narratives that Putin is propagating, the more difficult it will be to find a resolution to this conflict. Because Putin is trying to bog us down in debates about history, when history starts. In some stories, he says it's 1783, when Russia took Crimea from the Ottoman Empire. Sometimes he says it's 988, when Grand Prince Volodymyr of Kiev decides to assume Christianity and apparently did this in Khersones in Crimea. He takes us on a wild mystery tour of history. And the point that the United States has been trying to make since 1945, along with its allies, is that history doesn't matter. In moving forward, we're trying to emphasize the inviolability of borders, the emphasis on ensuring territorial integrity, upholding sovereignty and independence of states. And after 1945 and the creation of the United Nations, the agreements of the UN Charter said we were not going to go back to this. And Russia itself agreed this in all of its previous forms, including as the Soviet Union. They signed on to the Helsinki, Final Act in the 1970s, all of the agreements at the end of the Cold War as well, in Paris and elsewhere, with the NATO Founding Act, multiple agreements on recognizing not just Ukrainian territorial integrity, but all the rest of their neighbors. And, we have to keep holding Russia account on that score. I'll end there. I hope I've touched on all of the issues. I thought that was a great opening by Calder. And, obviously getting the messaging right, the communications right, as well as the intelligence right, and trying to prevent Vladimir Putin from manipulating history and applying history in ways that suit his purposes is going to be a very important part of this whole battle to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. What an incredible opening for our day. It's hard to ask for a better diagnosis of the challenge that we're continuing to grapple with in Russia, Ukraine. And thank you for taking the time to join us from the U.S. Senate amidst what was a really busy day for you. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Michael. And, really great to see everybody else on the Zoom here as well.